Thank you, Michael. I'm Dr. Helms. Some of you know me as your philosophy professor, which reminds me some of you have an assignment due tomorrow, and you know who you are. Tonight's topic is the human person, and I can say from spending just a few hours with our speakers tonight that each of them is an expert in the sense that they are delightful human beings. I think you're really going to enjoy this evening. The first speaker that we'll have is Dr. Ed Himelblau. He is a... Yes, he is one of ours. He is a molecular biologist here at Cal Poly. He received his PhD in cell and molecular biology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research interests include plant genetics and biology education. A popular and passionate teacher, he also publishes cartoons about science and teaching at himelblog.com, and I believe we'll be treated to some of those cartoons this evening. At least that's my hope. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And I have a few comments to start off. I'm grateful to the members of the Cal Poly Veritas Forum and the Alliance of Happy Atheists for the invitation to participate, and everyone who worked to put on this two-day event. Thank you very much. And I also want to thank Dr. Swamidass for traveling here to share his thoughts and expertise with us. So if we can go on to the next slide. I've been teaching and doing research here at Cal Poly for about 12 years with a focus on DNA and genetics, and students in my lab focus on understanding how plants grow and develop. Our favorite plants for this research are the popular vegetable crops shown here, and if we can go on to the next slide. We study the DNA of these plants. These are chromosomes here in this one picture, and we look for how changes at the DNA level affect the appearance and the survival of the plants. And for those two other plants over there, a change in their DNA accounts for the different ways that those plants have grown and developed. So honestly, I'm probably a little bit better prepared tonight to talk about the topic of what does it mean to be broccoli. But I'm determined to do my best on the assigned topic that we have tonight here. But I'm not an anthropologist. I don't study cognition. I feel like I know some things about genes and DNA and how living things change over the generations. And I also believe that everything that happens can be explained through science. So my hope is that my perspective tonight will be informative to you. I'd like to start by showing you some stuff that I just enjoy thinking about. If we can go to the next slide. So just real quick, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand and keep it up if you know the name of one of your grandparents. So if you know the name of one of your grandparents, keep your hand up. All right, so most people do. All right, now keep your hand up if you know the name of one of your great-grandparents. All right, still a lot of people there. All right, hands up still if you know the name of one of your great-great-grandparents. See, there are a lot go down usually. There I can see there's a few people with their hands up who can maybe go back another couple generations or two. But it's interesting how quickly our vision of the past gets kind of fuzzy like this. These people, these great-great-grandparents, the 16 of them, they were incredibly important to us, and they gave us all of our DNA, but we often know very little about them. But we can go back a little bit further if we go to the next slide. If we go back 200 years, it's about 10 generations. What was going on? Let's see. Illinois had just become a state. Abraham Lincoln had his 9th birthday, and Mary Shelley published Frankenstein. And you had 1,024 great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, right? Represented by the circles and squares up here. We use circles for females and squares for males. Now, you maybe got your last name from one of these people, but you got your DNA from all of them, right? These are all of your ancestors. If any one of these people had not reproduced, you wouldn't be here today, right? And so it's really kind of amazing how we have this incredible link to all of this, big human population in the past, but we don't always know that much about them. But that's just 200 years. We could go back further. If we go to the next slide, I like to ask my students at the beginning of the quarter, what fraction of my DNA do you think is of Neanderthal origin? And the answers range somewhere from 0% to up to 99%. But I know the answer to this because I spat into a little cup and sent it away to a personal genomics company. You go to the next slide. And so I know that I am 2.4% Neanderthal. And for those of you who are DNA fans out there, that works out to about 72 million base pairs. But what it means is if you go far enough back in my family, and really the family of anybody who's from European or Asian background, you're going to find some Neanderthals there among your family history. But we can go back even further than that too, right? Can we go to the next slide? So this is a pretty complicated image, but it says something about modern biology. Up in the corner there, the upper, that corner, there's those colored blocks that represent the 23 human chromosomes. And then around, as we go around the circle, we have the 24 chromosomes of chimpanzee, the chromosomes of mouse, and then the ones that aren't labeled are the chromosomes of a more distant relative, the zebrafish, which is a little fish with stripes on it. So, but from the human chromosome, those threads that are emanating out, there's one thread for each gene in the human genome. And by looking at an image like this, you can see how, by following those threads, we can see how we're related to all of these other vertebrates. Now, if we go on to the next slide, this number is one that's kind of famous, the 98% similarity between humans and chimps. So when we think about it, there's that much DNA that's the same between humans and chimps, and then there's that little fragment that's different. But even we can go further than that, because not all of our DNA does stuff. It doesn't all influence the way we grow and develop. So on the next slide, we can see that the part that is different and has a function may be even smaller than that. And so maybe we're done here tonight. Maybe that's what it means to be human, that tiny little bit of our DNA that distinguishes us from the chimpanzee and that is functional. I have a feeling we probably have more to talk about than that, but that's one way to look at it. So for the next few minutes, we can go to the next slide. I'd like to focus on the relationship between humans and the rest of nature, which are represented by animals in this drawing. I'd be pretty surprised if there were too many people here tonight that felt like this picture was a really good representation of the human relationship to the rest of nature. With humans, they're on a pedestal, clearly elevated above the rest of life. Modern biology definitely rejects this idea. But isn't it tempting to think that maybe humans are special and at least a tiny bit different from the other animals? After all, we have exceeded all the other animals in language and culture and technology. Can we go to the next slide? So maybe this drawing captures that idea better, that the thing that elevates us and distinguishes us from the rest of life is very small, but it is there. Next slide, please. So it's this narrow thing that distinguishes us. Now, in some faiths, this might be described as the divine spark. In others, it could be the ability to attain enlightenment. And we may think, sure, we're animals, and we're part of nature, but humans have this kind of hard to define element that elevates us. There's something that makes humans different. Even if you don't define it, I think it's very tempting and even very comforting to feel that way. But I think it's important that we push back against that thinking, that we reject this idea that humans are in any way separate or elevated. Next slide. I think it creates a really good and important struggle to have to be okay with the idea that we're not elevated or somehow not part, or somehow apart from the rest of life. If we can go to the next slide. Biology tells us that we're all on the same plane as all life on Earth, and that should define our understanding of ourselves and frame our ethical relationships with the rest of life. So on the next slide, we have an image that comes to us through modern biology and fast, cheap genome sequencing. So around the edge of this circle are representatives of all of the branches of life that are found today. And all life, including humans, can be derived from a common origin. Next slide, shown in the middle. Oh, oops. Can you advance it, please? All right. All right, we'll switch that. So this is a simpler version of that. Okay, there we are. So that's that's the origin, the first life that evolved from non-living chemicals billions of years ago through a series of natural events that are poorly understood today. And so with the next arrow, we can see here's humans on this big web of life, and next, here's broccoli. And there's all the other organisms around there too, and you can see how they're all related back to that. Now if we can advance on. So this was kind of a famous drawing by Darwin that he drew in the margins of one of his notebooks. And it was probably the first time somebody really glimpsed this relationship and the significance of it. So if we go on, here's the root of the tree down at the bottom. And from there, we can trace a line to us, if we advance it, please, and next to all other life on Earth. So we're part of this huge family. And if we go to the last slide, I find this extremely reassuring. Now, does this kinship mean that we will always treat each other and the environment well? No. But I think that embracing the idea that humans aren't separate leads to behaviors and attitudes that are ethical and sustainable. I think it's the best thing we have going for us. To be human is to have a close kinship to each other and to everything else alive on Earth. Thanks.
Are you signing up?
I'll introduce you. Would you like me to introduce you? Thank you, Dr. Himelblau. It's my privilege to now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Joshua Swamidass, who is a computational biologist at Washington University, St. Louis. Dr. Swamidass received both his MD and PhD from the University of California, Irvine. His research focuses on using computational methods to solve problems at the intersection of medicine, chemistry, and biology. He blogs at peacefulscience.org, finding confident faith in a scientific world. Thank you, and welcome to Cal Poly.
Thanks. It's a real privilege to be here, but I'm having some problems with my slides, and I hope that we can get this solved here. There we go. So what does it mean to be human? Like I said, it's a privilege to be here, and I like how you said why I'm qualified. I'm a nice human being. I'd like to think that.
It's true.
Well, part of what it means to be human is you have some labels attached to you, right? Whether you like them or not. So for me, I'm a Christian, but I'm also a physician and a scientist, and I'm normally invited to come and talk, and it ends up being about science. And we are going to talk about science today. But also, as I was preparing for this, I also started to think a lot about my experiences as a physician, too. This question, what does it mean to be human, is one of the great questions. It's a question that all great art is based on, all great writing. It's what defines, even the fact that we're asking the question, what does it mean to be human, is one way how you know you're human, right? Because there isn't chimpanzees out there doing Veritas forums on what does it mean to be a chimpanzee. And your dogs don't congregate in the backyard talking to you through, what does it mean to be a dog? One of the defining features, I would say, of even being a human and asking that question, what does it mean to be human? And we ask it in many different ways, and I'm going to just give you some of the different ways I've been thinking about it. In particular, I had a big change happen in my life this last Saturday. Just to be real with you, it was not expected, but on Saturday night, I got a phone call and found out that my father died. As you can imagine, that threw everything into disarray. I had to cancel plane flights, and there was a question about whether or not I'd even be here to talking to you today. And just the end of that story, I'm here. and it also had me thinking really deeply about this question, not because of the presentation, actually, but just because of this experience that's so shared. It's been interesting. As people have found out about this and been talking to me, they'll start sharing stories about how they had when their father died or their mother died too. There's this defining experience and relationship we have with death that is part of what it means to be human. Now, yes, all creatures, all animals die, but there's something different, it seems, about how we contemplate it. So here you can see my father with me back in Thanksgiving, the last time I saw him, with my little son, Caleb. Isn't he cute? and he's like totally healthy. You would not, I didn't expect him to pass away. He just had a heart attack and he was gone. And it's left me lost in questions. And the thing about grief and the thing about the sadness of it and how it impinges on your life is, as hard as it is actually, it's very humanizing too. And I guess the way how I want to think about this is partly because it gives me a way to talk about many things, but also because I think it's fundamentally true. Part of, I think, the defining thing of what it means to be human, it's not the whole thing. I'm not going to supplant all great art in this claim. But I think one of the great things, or one of the defining things of being a human is to be lost in questions. Is to be in the grand questions, wondering about them, not really satisfied with the simple answer, really wanting something deeper. In fact, that's why I got drawn to science, because science is not actually about the answers. what hooked me onto science was not science class. It was my first time working in a research group and finding out, oh, there's unanswered questions in science, and maybe I might be involved in actually trying to figure out what's going on there. And science is kind of a loaded term, so I just wanted to briefly just explain to you what I mean by that. I just mean it's a specific way of studying nature. I mean specific because when someone writes a poem about a sunset, that's studying nature too, but it's not science. That's not a derogatory statement. It just means it's not what we're doing as scientists. There's scientists that are poets, there's poets that are scientists, but poetry isn't science per se. A way to find provisional explanations, and I think this is actually really important, in that we're not sure actually about everything that we're saying, but we're giving our best guess at what it is, and we're doing everything we can to make that better. And we want to really get explanations. It's not just statements of doctrine or whatever. We want to know, like, how does the world work? And that gets to this issue I said of like mechanism. We want to know how it works. We're not actually after the great questions in science, except for one. The great question we're interested in science is, what's the fundamental structure of the world? How does it work? That's what we care about. And that's actually the grand question in which I've lost myself entirely for my entire career. That is what I do with my life. And this other weird rule, which actually arises from Christian theology, and it's also been really enshrined there, is this idea that we don't ever invoke God, because when we're doing science, we're not really trying to do theology and figure out what God does and who he is and all that. We're really just trying to understand how his creation works. And so that's why I'm not at all surprised that you don't see in science textbooks a declaration that God exists or doesn't, because we just never ask that question. That's not what we're doing there. So that's what I mean by science. But I could also just as easily told you about my research. I've really been fortunate to have like a great group of students working with me. We look at using machine learning and something called deep learning, if you've heard about that, to understand how chemical structures interact with the human body and how they become toxic, and also how that's different for children. So one of the things we really care about is maybe can we figure out when it is that there's going to be drugs that are really safe for adults but really dangerous for children. Can we predict that ahead of time? I also do work in cancer genomics, and there's these questions too about how to really serve patients that come up in medical imaging too. So I'm just a very curious person. I have tons of projects in different places. One of the great things about being a scientist and a professor is that you can basically study whatever you want to. As long as it's significant somehow it's connected to that grand question, and you do it with rigor, you can really come to really just, they'll just let you do it. I mean, I think it's the greatest job on earth, by the way, in case you're curious about graduate school. One of the other great questions that comes up in science and other places too is, where do we come from? Ed talked about how similar we are to chimpanzees. I want to give a little bit more there to explain that. So we have a mouse and a man, okay? I'm the man up there. And we have a chimpanzee and we have a rat. And he said that the human and the chimpanzee are about 2% different. It all depends on how you measure it. But for that metric, there is a way you can measure it that it comes out to 2%. But that's actually not the really convincing thing. The more surprising thing is how similar mice are to rats. How similar do you think they are? It turns out that they're only 80% similar. Isn't that weird? That's a weird feature of the world. And you can find other ways to measure that difference. And you'll always come up with this thing where like mice and rats are much more different than humans and chimpanzees, even though mice and rats are much more similar. Now, that's a puzzle that we just don't know how to make sense of until we encounter this formula, that rate times time equals distance. A very simple formula, right? You learned that in high school. That's the basic evolutionary formula, and that explains it. The reason why mice and rats are more different than humans and chimpanzees is because they split apart a longer time ago, and they also mutate quicker. And so we find out is that most of the changes in DNA aren't actually about function, they're just recording history. Isn't that cool? And so it also kind of opens this idea of like scientific thinking where you can't interpret a number without a control. Right? You can't really know if that 2% means anything for the 98%. What is that? When I put up a control, a negative control, and then all of a sudden it makes sense. That's what I love about science. It kind of tells you this really non-intuitive thing about the world. And I mean, I am a Christian, but I think God created us through an evolutionary process. I think this is not something that threatens my faith. And it just helps me understand how he did it. But, we think about this in other ways, too. Like I said, I've been thinking about my father. This is Caleb with my father just the last time we saw him. Aren't they happy? It's funny, one of the staff here looks a little bit like my grandfather, except for a white version of him. And Caleb is very cautious about new people, but as soon as he saw David Zagrodny, he just leapt towards him. And I think he misses his grandfather. There's this thing about where does Caleb come from? He doesn't just come. To say that science has settled the story, it kind of misses something really fundamental here. Where does Caleb come from? He comes from me. He also comes from his grandfather. He's only 2 years old. He wasn't even 2 when we took the photo. We're showing him pictures, trying to remember, so he'll remember that. We are talking to him about his grandfather. I really hope, I pray that he's going to remember something about him when he's older, even though he's just right at that border where he may not. It's funny thinking about this too, because I know a little bit about biology. One surprising thing is grandparents are such a fundamental part of what it means to be human. But did you know that most animals, we're talking about the vast majority, I'll give you the exceptions, don't have grandparents? Now, let's think about that for a moment. Yes, they have genetic grandparents, but they don't have grandparents that are connected. They don't recognize their grandkids as their own. Does that make sense? There are a couple exceptions. So sometimes people will point to killer whales, and that's because it's a female, defined group, and so there's a sense of grandmother there, but there isn't a sense of grandfather. You can wonder if chimpanzees are that way, and it turns out that chimpanzees actually don't have a sense of grandparents there, which is really remarkable because they're old enough to have it. If you look at human history, it's only within the last couple. So Homo sapiens, our taxonomical category, arises debates between 200 to 350,000 years ago. But it wasn't until maybe about 20,000 years ago that grandparents arise. The reason why is that most of us were just dying too young. So you just wouldn't have your grandparents around. So there wasn't any connection like that. It's not that Caleb would be the exception in the sense that he would have been one of the few that actually got to meet his grandparents until very, very recently in history. And yet, can you imagine, what it means to be human right now? It includes grandparents, right? And yet it's something that is just very peculiar to us in many ways. I'm not trying to say it's unique in this absolute sense, but it's just something where we just have to understand that to be one of us is to be very different than one of our pets. Another fundamental question, once again, that comes up, especially as I think about death, is there's many ways to put this question. Is are we good or are we evil? That's the Lord of the Rings way to put it, right? But another way to put it is are we leaving this world in a better place than we found it? Are we just people or are we unjust? And I'll tell you, there's something about science. It doesn't really tell us much about these things. Science just does not answer this question, is this the right thing to do? It just doesn't. It doesn't tell us, it can tell us how to make a nuclear bomb. It doesn't tell us how to use it. Think about that for a moment. That actually starts to make you wonder if it's not even really good, it's evil, because it gives power indiscriminately. It gives it to evil people. You think about sterilization and eugenics. As we came to understand more things about the human body, we did not use that knowledge well. And science can get you to that point, and medically, you can get to the point where you understand how genetics works and how to select for things, and start kind of defining what you think is good and not. But there's nothing in science that has that guardrail to say, yeah, maybe you could do that, but maybe it's not something you should do. There's nothing there for that. And if it's not human to think about that question, we're in a very dark and dangerous place, because it just is a place where there's nothing to hold us back from the great horrors of this world. I'm not trying to say that there's only one solution to it in the sense that we all need to become Christian or something like that. I'm rather saying that part of the fundamental nature of what it means to be human is to be captured in that question, really trying to make sense of it and to do it well, and not be satisfied with the simple answers. mean, I also think, too, about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments where, out of curiosity, which is the fundamental emotion of science, which is good, right? But out of curiosity, physicians and scientists intentionally infected 399 black people. There was, they passed it on to their partners, syphilis. There was I think it was close to 20 children that were born dead or deformed. Think about that. And that went on for decades. It started in the 30s, I think it was, continued to the 70s. No one really stopped to think, is this actually a good thing to do? Yes, curiosity drives us forward, but is this the cost we want to take? I think, science at its best is a humanizing process, but if it becomes a total view of the world, it starts to dehumanize us. It starts to make us do things that only monsters do. And we do it, and we feel justified as we do it. It's a very scary thing that I worry about, because the power that comes to me in science, am I going to use that power well? I think you can't look at history and see how this is done and just not be lost about, when it comes to the day you die. In the grand scheme of things, when you look at yourself from outside yourself, not by your own standards, am I a good person? Have I done good, or did I just think I was good? That is a very human question. I've been thinking about this a lot in St. Louis, so it's important to remember the year we're in. We're in 2018. This is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. It's going to be coming up in a couple months. This is important because he lost his life, and he was arguing for segregation over integration. Are we going to live in a society that's segregated by race, or it's integrated, that we treat each other as a family? Now, I live in St. Louis. St. Louis isn't quite like San Luis Obispo because it's a segregated city in a very clear way. I'm not saying that there isn't issues here, but if there's any separation here, usually it's because there's a way to separate by greater geographic distances. In St. Louis, it's right there. There's a black community and there's a white community. And 50 years ago, Martin Luther King died. We all agreed that integration was the right way to go, yet we're still segregated. Is that a good society or not? There's this quote that I think is really important. I was reading Martin Luther King in the preparation for this year, just really thinking about it deeply. And he said, but America, as I look at you from afar, I wonder whether your moral and spiritual progress has been commensurate with your scientific progress. It seems to me that your moral progress lags behind your scientific progress. And I think he's right. So I live on the Del Mar Divide. I don't know how much you guys follow the news, but there was a trial that happened where there was a police officer that killed a black person, and not getting to the details of that, people were really upset when this man was acquitted. There was riots throughout my city. There was protests, and this picture here is on the street that's just hundreds of yards from my house. I went out and I walked out on the street. I'm thinking about Martin Luther King because I've been reading about him, and I walked down the street, and I saw, at that time, nonviolent protesters encountering police officers like this, looking like the military lined up. And I'm not trying to say who's right or wrong there, but this is a very disconcerting image for me. I don't know how you feel about it, but it's very disconcerting to me. And I felt this helplessness there of, I'm a scientist. What I do is science, and I have nothing to offer this. All I could do is just go and observe and walk away, and I'm still left in thought. I'm still left with so many questions, lost in the questions of that moment, not knowing what that means for us to have had a great man guide us towards integration, and then for 50 years, we just forgot. So, are we good or are we evil? What does it mean to be human? I really believe one of the most humanizing things we can do is to be lost in the grand questions. So join me.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers. I think I'd like to actually start by asking whether you have a question for each other. Is there anything that you would like to ask, maybe Ed leading us off, is there anything you would like to ask to Josh? And then if there's anything you would like to ask following up on what he just said that you might have thought of while you were listening.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for a lot of good things to think about there. You know, the idea of using power well, I think that I got into science because I pretty much thought it seemed pretty cool. And then when I learned about cells and DNA, I thought those were really cool too, and I wanted to learn more about that. But I think what kept me in it was when I started working in labs, it was the people that I interacted with there. And I don't think I've ever, been around a group of people that were, smarter and funnier and more open and aware of things. It was just like the discussions, everyone was there doing science, but they were, but the conversations were about all kinds of things. It was really, I thought, a neat group that I just wanted to be around and be part of. And I think from that, I never really had much anxiety about like science collectively, using power wrong, just because my own experiences were so positive that way. I wonder, does that sound like something that your experience has been too, or have you?
Well, yeah. So I agree with that. So science
yeah.
has been a very positive experience for me here. But I'll tell you that being in St. Louis has kind of opened my eyes to things. One thing that really has struck me is that science is segregated. So yeah, it's a great thing that we're here, but how many black people are here? I mean, I'm not trying to be like provocative. I mean, it's just really when you start to ask that question and go to conferences and you look around and you see that, wait a minute, if this is such a grand piece of society, why is it that huge portions of our society are just not here? And it started to really weigh on me. So I think science is or can be one of those great forces for good, but can also be a great force for evil. And I think one of the hardest things we have to do, because it goes against us, our natures in some ways, we have to be able to see things from other people's points of view too. And really start to see people who are very different from us as if they're our family. And so if we start to see, for example, I live in a white area next to WashU. I have dark skin. I've definitely experienced racism, but there's something different that's gone on with the African American community in St. Louis and really across the country where they're not finding their way into the university. They don't have the privilege of doing science alongside us. That's not the choices that are being there to them. And at some point, the only way that's going to change is when I'm personally upset that my family is being excluded here. And not just me, like we're all that way. And we realize that this isn't something for some of us to care about. It's just us being truthful about our connection to one another. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think equity and equal access to education and science is a huge challenge and a huge barrier. You're right. I guess, yeah, I think it's a big challenge, right? I can't say more.
Well, to follow up on that, do you think that science does have something to say about racism or about those kinds of social problems, or is it just to the side or unrelated?
Yeah, I think so. Does it have something to say about social and racial problems? Again, I think that my experience around lots of different scientists has been that it's been, a group that, thinks very deeply about. I guess I feel like if more people thought as scientists do, we'd have fewer problems, and there would be fewer, the sort of disparities that that lead to the problems were experienced in St. Louis and other cities where there's a lot of segregation would be reduced if there were more people that were comfortable thinking in a scientific way and applying and really embracing what science tells us about and particularly in my field in biology and genetics about the relationship between all of us, because we're really incredibly closely related, and those things that can drive wedges between groups are really don't have a basis in biology so much, but are really constructs of the society and politics. And I think we can get over those. And I think embracing a really scientific view of life and our relationship to each other is a way that would be a positive way forward there.
Good. So in other words, really understanding that close kinship would already address, if we all thought that way and had that in the front of our minds, maybe that really would help us think about each other as family.
Yeah, I think the more people know that and understand that about the relationship of all humans to each other, the less likely we are to have disparities. But we're still a long way, obviously. Knowing that and solving all the issues that lead to those disparities, there's a big gap between there.
And do you have a question you'd like to ask, just based on what you heard from Ed, or we can move on if you don't have anything?
Well, yeah,
pressing?
Obviously, I didn't know exactly what you were going to be sharing. You didn't know exactly what I was going to be sharing. It kind of ended up actually being pretty contrasting in a lot of ways. What do you think about that? What did you think about what I had to share, or do you think I got something wrong, or I kind of added something to the table that's like, okay, maybe that's actually a point that maybe I missed?
No, I don't think you got anything wrong, and I appreciate you sharing something so personal with us, and that was, I think it speaks a lot to the reason why we're here tonight, and yeah, I think my presentation was more about, hey, here's what we know now, and let's take this and move forward, and your presentation was a lot more about like, wow, we really, don't know that much, and there's a lot to ponder and a lot to wonder about. And, during the course of your presentation, I started thinking like, oh, that's a great question, and that's something I haven't thought enough about myself. I suppose maybe, if anything, as I listened to yours, I was thinking that science does have, the danger of giving you too much of a sense of certainty over what you're thinking about, because there's a lot of evidence that backs it up. And I think, raising the kind of questions that you did is very helpful.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think we're really on the same page. We just didn't get a chance to talk. Maybe we would have agreed. You would have given the same talk.
Yeah.
I'm just playing. But who's playing, I'll tell you one thing, because I don't want that to come off rude. I want to explain that one thing that I really respect. Actually, this is true of most scientists. We really respect people who change their mind. One thing that you'll see that's somewhat unique to scientific publications is retractions in places. Not to saying that you made a retraction here, but that's actually one way how we kind of judge people's character. So, and that makes sense. Like, why would you trust someone if they have a false sense of security and they've never been able to admit when they're doing, when they kind of missed an angle on something, right? Wrong is too strong of a word. I don't think you said anything wrong, but I don't know. So I just wanted to clarify that. All right, now that I've clarified that, where was I going to go? I forgot.
Well, it might be a good chance. Have you ever changed your mind about anything?
Yeah, so I was raised a young Earth creationist, so I changed my mind about evolution, and it was really because of it was several things, but part of it was actually getting the training to look at the data for myself. I found out what people told me about the data was different than what the actual data was, and so that was a big thing. That wasn't it too. I'd also really encountered something very real in my life, and in my faith. My faith wasn't just a system of belief. I'd actually encountered something real there. And it needed to make sense with that. And so part of that was like, okay, so how does this all fit with Scripture? And there was a point where all kind of the pieces filled in, and it just made sense that I really couldn't actually identify a conflict between evolution and what I was reading in Scripture. And, I just couldn't find a conflict. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of people who have interpretations of Scripture, which is man's word, that conflict with Scripture, which I would call God's word. But when it came to what Scripture actually said, not what people said it said, then I didn't see a conflict. And then, like I said, when people would say different things about the evidence, but when I actually looked at the evidence and I had the training to do that, there got to be a point where it's like, I just don't see any reason not to go that direction. A great example is exactly what happened with the similarity between humans and chimpanzees. I remember exactly when I discovered that. It was in 2005 when the chimpanzee genome was sequenced when I was in my PhD. And they actually showed those exact numbers right there. And I was trained enough I could actually read that original paper, understand that. I could actually go verify it myself with the actual data. And there's a point where I saw all the arguments against it, and they were just factually incorrect. They would often ignore key pieces. Like it's not just that we're similar; it's the full pattern of similarity, and the fact that it's mapped to a formula. and that we can actually, and at that time we actually didn't even yet have a direct way to measure mutation rates, but now we do. We've actually been able to go through and verify, well, how fast actually are humans mutating from generation to generation? We can actually directly measure that now. And you just see this coherence, like it's predictive, and it's directly the data we use with medicine. And so there's just a point like, wait, this makes sense, and there's no reason not to do it. Except there was one reason. My entire family was young Earth creationists. And so there was like some real cost that came with making and kind of being open about who I really was at that point. But then fundamentally, even when there's costs, it's really important to get into these questions and find an honest answer. And I was willing to pay that cost. So yeah, I do change my mind. I'd like to think I do on important things.
And did that realization when you were encountering that new evidence, did that change or threaten your idea of what it means to be a human? Or is it more that you thought you had been told lies in the past, or what was
So if you look at the story, I actually really like the way how you presented the presentation, because as much as I'm kind of picking on you a little bit, it actually is a very common way of presenting it, that the evidence just shows that we're no different. And if that's true, then maybe there is a conflict. But if you actually look at what at least my faith teaches, it teaches a paradox. It teaches that we're continuous with other creatures, but there's also something different. So it's not, so all I think is going on with science is just teaching one side of that paradox. It's teaching the fact that we're continuous with the animal kingdom, that we're creatures. It's like basic, teaching. It's been part of historical theology for a very long time. But that's just not the whole story. The problem is if you think that half the story is the whole story. It's also true that there's something exceptional about us, and it's not easy to define. That's part of how we know it's transcendent. It's not just because we're all a particular height, therefore that's what makes us different. The fact that it's hard to define is part of why it has us captured. Like there's something there that we can see analogs at times, like weak analogies in the animal kingdom. But I'll tell you what, you can see it in the movies, right? You can see movies where people, like The Jungle Book, where people go out into the woods and they find a whole bunch of human-like animals, right? That share the human condition, even though we have a hard time describing that, right? That human condition is not actually found out there. Like we're not in conversations with our dog in the same way we are right now. Like I said, chimpanzees do not have the human condition, even though we have a hard time defining it. There's something that's different about that. Also, it's not just about abilities too, because I think as much as you say we're connected, I agree we're connected, but there's more to it than that. Like if I had my toddler here, right, and I had a chimpanzee who had about equivalent abilities at that stage, right? Or let's say even it was an older child and something happens to him and he's just never is really going to progress beyond that of a 4-year-old chimp. Now, I care about my child. I'm going to say I value this child more. But I think everyone here is going to say that there's ethical worth here in my child more than that chimpanzee, right? And it's not going to be determined based on his abilities. And there's something that's really important for the fabric of society that even if we can't even justify why we think that's the case, we generally think it is. And I just think I found something that kind of makes sense of that, where it's a faith that's full of paradox, that says that we're of the dust, we're continuous with creation, we're material, but we also have the breath of God, where we have the image of God on us, something that transcends it. And we don't actually have a good way of defining that all the time. It's that transcendent part that's hard to put our finger on. But the fact that we can't explain it well doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Yeah, and I feel like that's, and so I would describe myself as being a totally secular person or not a person of faith at all. And yeah, when I think about people, as I was getting ready for this, I thought, I found it very easy for that to creep into my mind. Yeah, there's something there that makes us different. But and I said it in my starting thing, but I feel like it's a good struggle for us to push back against that belief. And
but why is that good? Why is that a thing? Like, what are you afraid of with
right.
that?
Well, because I think that we're never going to be more human than we are right now. You're never going to be more alive than you are right now. And I feel like if you say like, oh yeah, I'm human, but there's also this thing that I can't explain. I think it almost takes you out of that moment of being human. I know for sure that this is my one life that I'm going to have on this planet, and when I'm gone, I'm truly and utterly gone. And I hope that the relationships I've had and the maybe a little of the work that I've done has positive memories that last for some people. But I really know that's it. And I think that, I don't know, I'm reluctant to say that, oh yeah, maybe there's something more, because I just personally really feel like that's not true. And I guess I don't want to be thinking that there's some next thing that's going to happen, or I guess just to go back, I'm never going to be more human or more alive than I am right now, and I think I want to really focus on that or embrace that.
And is there anything that would ever change your mind about that, do you think? Or is that a very settled view?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I admire very much your transition that you went through, coming from the family upbringing you did. Again, I was in a family where there wasn't any strong religious teaching or thoughts or anything like that, and I started to wonder, like, what would it take for me to question what I think in my upbringing enough that I would go through a transition as broad as you did. I'm not sure, and I don't know that I would be able to. I almost wonder, like, if do you feel like if you had grown up? I'm sorry, I'm not really answering the question, but I'd be curious to find this out too. If you had grown up in a household that wasn't religious, do you feel like you could have gotten to this point and felt like, do you think you would feel that something was missing from your life? If or maybe.
Well, so a lot of religious people will say, "Oh, is there something missing in your life?" I don't actually think that that's enough for me. So maybe I'm just like a broken person. So that's why. Maybe that's not enough for me. I guess I was a bit more evidential. I was a bit more like, this needs to be grounded. It needs to be warranted. There was a point. What I can tell you is, there's a counterfactual of, like, in a family that was secular, and that I don't know how to explain. But I can tell you that as being raised as in a religious family, there was a point where I definitely made a conscious decision that that I didn't want to go down this path unless I really believed it was true. The fact that my parents thought it was true was not enough, and the fact that I liked things about it was not enough. And I would rather be miserable and alone and at conflict with my parents, but doing something true, than just kind of going on with the charade. So that was definitely a point I got to, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And but I think what happened is I ended up really sifting through everything. I was reading lots of different world religions. I was reading just a lot of stuff, talking to people. My parents. Of course, I didn't talk to my family about it. I didn't want them to know, because that would be scary. It would be. You don't have my dad yet. But there's this point where, I sifted through so much stuff. And I got to tell you, like, I am a Christian, but I even hesitate to use that term, because there's a lot of junk out there that is called Christian. There's a lot of churches that had stuff that, I can't endorse even now. There was definitely, even, a lot of Christians that were not really good people. It was just, there was just so much stuff that I could just see myself walking away from. And then I encountered one thing that really seemed, okay, this actually might be something truthful, and if that's true, that actually makes all this other crap worth dealing with. You know what I mean? And it was, I read a book called More Than a Carpenter by Josh McDowell, and since then, as I've gotten older, I've read other books too. But he talked about this person called Jesus that, I'd read about, but as a historical figure and how to make sense of the resurrection. And now, as I came to understand that, and I'll probably be talking about this more tomorrow night if you guys want to hear, but it just really came to seem that there was this real thing that happened in history 2,000 years ago that rechanged everything. And one of the grand questions is, what is that? And as I looked and really wondered about that, I came to really wonder if maybe this person really did rise from the dead, as prophecy said, that was confirmed by radio dating, I found out, and all of these things. And then I had an experience with like a living presence connected to that too. It was kind of the combination of those things that really kind of gave me like personal knowledge of this, where, yeah, so I guess I would have left unless that had happened. Does that make any sense? Mm-hmm. And I mean, I don't know how to like make that happen for someone else, except for to say that's just what happened for me.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I would say something like that has never happened for me, and I've never felt like I've missed anything. You know, and that not to say I'm right and somebody else isn't right, but that's just been my experience, right? And I feel like, and I suppose that my training in science and my thoughts about science have fed into that as well. You know, the feeling like that. Oh yeah, that the world is pretty complete, and now I feel like a lot that I learned about biology, sort of backs that up and bolsters that. And yeah, it's interesting to talk to somebody who feels that they can, have that same understanding and everything of the science, and yet also have that faith in this other thing too. Where I've just felt like I've got this one thing, and there's nothing missing for me.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say your position is pretty common among my colleagues. Like, you're not crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, they probably think I'm crazy, but I guess what I would just say is that I don't have any reason to dispute things in science. Like, I mean, I think we largely agree. I mean, it's to the extent that scientists disagree and like to debate details, that's what's going to be true about us, right? But not more. But when it comes to things that are the really pressing things in this world, like things like injustice, it just seems that if injustice is real, if we're really supposed to be dealing with that, it just seems that the scientific language and way of seeing the world is really impoverished to deal with it. How do you think about that as a scientist?
Yeah, those are hard issues. I think when thinking about humans, about behavior, about even things as mundane as nutrition or things like that, I think it's helpful to try and put yourself back 300,000 years, when humans were evolving and modern humans were appearing from very similar pre-human ancestors. And you think like most of our, the ways our body works and the way our brains work were formed during that time when the human experience was a short life and a constant struggle and a very small group of people that you associated with who were all very closely related to you, and a lot of isolation. And that's, we're a very young species. We've only had 150,000 years, since it's appearing, and that's kind of what we're wired for. And now we've started living in these big, highly interconnected societies and civilizations. We have, access to foods and technologies and things that we never had before. But to some extent, we're still in that, our brains have been a little slow to catch up with us from an evolutionary standpoint, and we're still a little bit wired for that way that our very ancient ancestors lived. And I believe that we're working through that. I think that it's we're in a very different kind of, we have very different kind of lives and very different kind of experiences now. And but we're still kind of wired to form these close local connections. Yeah.
I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with that. But the issue is, if that's all there is, that's just a descriptive statement about the situation that has a little bit of unsubstantiated hope in it. It's not like we have evidence that it's going to get better. Actually, I could probably present a lot of evidence that it's not going to get better. And Martin Luther King, it's interesting. Like he grew up in a segregated world, and like he kind of thought through what he wanted to go to graduate school for. He ended up getting a PhD. It wasn't in science, and it makes sense, because if the problem of this world is injustice, science actually isn't the way forward. He chose theology. And when you actually read his writings, like he's getting resources for something from somewhere to kind of envision a world. Like if you think about injustice from a scientific point of view, it's about data, right? So you kind of look at our world and you compare it to others, and it comes about grading on the curve. And it actually becomes primarily a rationalization for apathy and just for kind of letting things be. Because there's great reasons to explain why we're here. And if that's all we have, I mean, maybe that's all we have. But that's a very scary reality if that's true. Maybe that is reality, and we should accept the reality. But I think maybe that doesn't have to be. Maybe there's a way to look for things beyond science that can help us deal with the things that are beyond science too.
Right. Yeah, I got off track with something else. I was trying to get to that too, right? And you pointed out that science can tell you a lot about how the world works or how the body works or whatever, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how to live. You know, as a personal story, my mother was a 5th grade teacher, and I remember when I was in college and studying a lot of science, you know, it was a time like any time when there was something bad happening in the world, and I asked her, like, how do you teach, you know, that? How do you help people, you know, feel empathy for you know, for other people, and how do you foster that? And she, without a single hesitation, said literature. You know, because it's the way that you can put yourself into the shoes of somebody else. You know, I think that, so I guess maybe that's a little bit of an answer to the question you asked me a while ago, which is like, what are the ways that you get there? You know, and I had that own experience with my daughter when she was 2 years old. I remember this too. We were reading a book. We were reading a book called Dogger, which is a very nice book by Shirley Hughes. And a little boy loses his stuffed dog and then sees it on the table at a flea market later on because somebody found it, picked it up and put it on the table. And he goes to get his mother, and as he's running over, he sees another little girl picking it up to buy it. And I remember my daughter, 2 years old, sitting on my lap, went, oh, you know, and I realized it was sort of like that she could, at that moment, she was starting to develop that empathy to put herself in the position of that other person and realize, oh, that's the experience this person is having, and oh, this must be so hard. You know, so I feel like we do have a capacity for that also, you know, and again, I'm going to attribute this to our evolutionary past, and that was, you know, since we didn't have, you know, we weren't very well armored, and we didn't have claws and fangs, and we weren't the strongest animals out there. We had, you know, our brains evolved these other ways to survive, and I think that, you know, forging these connections and being able to think about, you know, each other in sort of abstract ways and think about the world in more abstract ways was part of what we did, and I feel like that is, you know, that can be a productive way forward in and of itself to help with solving some of these problems.
Thank you. I think it's a good time to add in some questions from the audience, if that's all right with you guys. So the first question, which I guess would be a question for Ed, would be, why do love and hope exist if they're not necessary for human survival?
All right, and feel free to jump in if you have some thoughts about this too. Why do love and hope exist if they're not essential for survival? Yes, I guess you could, for most of life on Earth.
But aren't hope and love kind of necessary for human survival? Mm-hmm. I would imagine now.
Right. No. Yes, I think that. Right. So we have plenty of examples of life that propagates itself and moves forward without any notion of.
No, but let me actually kind of take that question like a different way. Yeah. So this is actually, I got this from Ajit Varki, who's one of the leading experts in human evolution at UC San Diego. He's part of the CARTA program there, but he talks a lot about Wallace, who is like the equal co-inventor with Darwin of evolution. And he had doubts about evolution. Now, to be clear, I affirm evolution. I think Wallace did too. And that's not what's in question here. But what gave him doubts was the human mind. Think about this for a moment. Like, from a biological point of view, we think humans became, we don't know for sure, but behaviorally modern about 50,000 years ago. That means that, or 60,000 years ago when they leave Africa, right? So it means that we think that, you know, if you were to take someone from that time, put them at San Luis Obispo, you know, train them up like you would train up any other kid, that they would be indistinguishable from you. You wouldn't be able to tell that they were from 50,000 years ago. There's not like a biological difference between us and them. Think about that. That means that all the mental capacities for art, for calculus, for astrophysics, for genetics, for using iPhones, already exists long before it's ever needed. It's, you know, I know the answer in biology is exaptation. It's something for one purpose being used for another, but there's no other example of exaptation like this. So why is it that the human divine mind develops that way in a way that we don't see happening in any other animals? Like, it's not like there's any evidence that there was a dinosaur that had a human mind. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I don't mean literally a human mind. I mean this thing that I'm talking about, right? There isn't any evidence that a dinosaur was out there. There wasn't cities being built. Like, velociraptors are really cool. They did not have iPhones. And so there's something different, and it seems to predate all the selective pressures for it. How do you make sense of that?
Let's see. I'm sorry, you have to
It was a long-winded
take
question.
a step back, right? So you
Sorry
lost me
about
with
that.
the dinosaur part. What do we?
It was a very colorful image.
Right. Yeah.
Could you narrow your question to like one,
Yeah,
a
so,
one-sentence question?
so like
Yeah.
50,000 years ago,
Yeah.
before the selective
Right.
pressures for it, like,
Yeah.
we see everything you need to play a violin, everything you need
Right.
to do math, which is a pretty profound thought when you think about it. It's the way
Yeah.
how we describe the world. There's no selective pressures, it seems, that's doing that. I mean, you could say acceptation, but there's no examples of acceptation like that anywhere else. I mean, that's
Right.
I mean, that's true, but that also kind of sidesteps the question. How do you make sense of that?
Right. Well, again, I will kind of go back to what I said before, that that you should be able to explain. It might be hard to explain, but there must be some. That the way our brains developed had some sort of. They were in response to some sort of pressure in the environment, some sort of selective pressure that helped us survive. And I mean, something like doing math or using an iPhone or something like that, those are pretty abstract tasks, and I think maybe one of the things that either the people that became humans or modern humans early on in their development, were very good at was that sort of abstract thinking, like, if I took this and that and I put them together, then it's going to work differently. Or if I that sort of planning ahead, like if we, I guess agriculture is a much later invention, but the idea that like, if we clear this little spot of dirt here and put seeds in the ground, then plants are going to grow and we could eat those. that was a revolutionary idea.
But
at
very
one
recent.
point.
That's
and
like
that was
really-
more recent. Yeah, it's not a very good, but it still, suggests the kind of thing that ability to think sort of abstractly was our tool for survival during these very tough times. And today, that is where we don't have to struggle as hard to survive. And, we live in a time when we have more, I mean, it's not distributed equally, but we have, we have more comfort and, probably more food and more security than people ever have. That capacity for abstract thought turns to other things. And I think that, it doesn't, to get all the way back to the original question, I'm stuck on how that gets us to love and hope. I feel like some of the abstractions that you mentioned, I feel like doing math and functioning in the modern society, I feel like that you can address that. The love and hope question is a much tougher one for me. Yeah.
Well, so to push on it a little more,
Sure, yeah,
maybe,
please.
to ask, so this is another question that I think is related.
Very popular, though. They want to ask you questions.
Yeah. Well, so it's not addressed to anyone in particular,
Right.
but I think you've shared your view on this already. The question is, why do we strive to be moral if we are the same as all other life? Why not embrace the survival of the fittest reality of the rest of the grammar, revise people. So why not embrace
Right.
the survival of the fittest? And it seems like you've made a pretty clear distinction between descriptive and then normative claims, so we can describe,
Very good philosophy.
I
terms,
know,
yes.
yeah, this is in fact what we want, but then what should we do? And what do you make of that kind of distinction?
Yes, right. So I'm gonna stick to my my point here that it's important for us to try to think of ourselves as just being on the same plane with the other animals. Now, if you look around through nature, not just animals, but everything's struggling for survival, and survival of the fittest is we don't have a lot of good examples out there in nature of ways to live, ways to share and live equally. There's lots of organisms other than humans that are really struggling for survival and, and trying to get as many resources as they can. I think this is what this question is about. Why are we any different? Are we just trying to acquire as many resources as we can?
Or why not just accept that that's who we are?
Or accept
and
that
why
that's
try
who
to
we
be
are, right.
different? Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think, yeah, I mean, I think that if you, and it goes to what I was saying before, that this is really it for me. I know that this is my one life, and so I could spend that time acquiring resources as much as I could and try to get advantages over other people, but I don't know, I suppose it is my nature, and we could debate about what that means exactly, but I don't feel that that's what's gonna give me satisfaction. I don't think that's what's gonna give me happiness. I mean, to some extent, I know people who do much more outreach and charity work and help other people way more than I do, and certainly to some extent, in life sometimes you have to sit on the couch and watch TV and look for very short-term personal gratification too. But I think that the best thing we can do, if we assume that we are, that this is it and there's nothing that comes next for us, is to try and help everybody and help other people to do as well as they can, and to treat everybody well and fairly, and to go about our lives in a way that is as sustainable as we can. We're always going to have an impact on the planet, but we can do what we can to minimize that. And so I feel like that's the what we can aspire to. And humans are, I guess, unique in the ability to think that way, right?
I have a question here that's more directed to you, but I'm going to ask you a broader version of it in a moment. So the question is, how do you reconcile the reason and science behind evolution and creationism? So do you find those two to conflict, or do you find them to be parallel, or how would you describe evolution in relation to creation?
Well, I mean, I would just say that God created us all. He designed us all. The way how he did it was through a process of common descent. That doesn't mean, so some people misunderstand what evolution is. So it actually comes out in the prior question. They say survival of the fittest. That's just a poetic description of it. That's not even accurate. It's really just differences in reproductive success. That's just doesn't have quite, you can't put that as a bumper sticker, right? You can say survival of the fittest, but not differences in reproductive success. And I mean, that's just an observable fact about the world. It doesn't necessarily even have a moral connotation to it, even from a religious point of view. And that's all that it's depending on. So part of it is how you tell a story. So when you kind of start actually looking at what the data is, for example, it's not that evolution tells us that we're, red in tooth and claw and at each other's throats, in that altruism is a myth. That's actually what people have kind of added on as a philosophical, overlay. If you kind of take those things off, see what it is. It's just a process of common descent. It doesn't say that God wasn't involved. It just says that we don't have clear evidence of that. And frankly, science doesn't look for that clear evidence either, so we shouldn't be that surprised that it doesn't see that. And it's just that. It's like that evidence that I just showed you on the screen. So that's all it is. And so when I read in Scripture, I see that God does not poof things into existence. What he says is that he asks the land to give forth plants and animals of many kinds. And that's one great way to describe what sounds to be evolution to me. Like if I was trying to explain this to people 2,000 or 4,000 years ago who didn't know anything about biology, I mean, I wouldn't sit down and start talking about DNA and all this stuff. I'd just say, God asked the land to give forth. And he did, and they did. And I think if you just read it literally, it just kind of tells you a little bit about some of what God has enabled the land to do. If he's going to call forth the land to do it, maybe the land has some ability. Now, once again, to be clear, I think one way how this gets misrepresented is that evolution is a godless process. There's nothing, we just have to remember that when people are silent about something, it doesn't mean that they're denying it. So science is silent about God. Okay, it's silent about God, but that's different than denying God's involvement or role. And so once you kind of keep that straight and you realize, oh yeah, okay, that makes some sense, then you realize that, hey, maybe he did inspire a mutation. I don't know. maybe he did do this or that. I don't know. I mean, like, we know, for example, that all of the dinosaurs were wiped out by an asteroid, right? Why did the asteroid come then? I mean, is that possibly, and there's just, I mean, that's kind of a question outside of science, right? It could be random stochasticity, or it could have been an act of God, and we even call it an act of God. I'm just trying to say that science, I just really came to see as one way to describe the world, that even when it's entirely correct and accurate, it's just never the complete view of the world. And the danger is when we come to see it as a complete view of the world. And that there's some things that are just really important that we're just never going to access outside of science. And I'm just comfortable with that. And I can be okay with science being sound on things because I know there's paths of knowledge outside of science.
And the broader version I'd like to ask you is whether you think that religion, or specifically Christianity, and science conflict, or do they just seem like different things and science is enough, or maybe science plus literature would be enough, so it's unnecessary? Or do you really find that they are in conflict and maybe can't coexist happily?
So I feel like science is enough. And you know, as I've worked in science, you know, again, I think my experience has been similar to you, that most people have a secular background. But I've always, you know, and I've regretted that I haven't taken the opportunities to talk more with those people who are scientists, who also are religious, and ask them, like, how do you make this work in your mind, you know? Because I think for me, it's just, you know, like I said, you know, science is enough. It doesn't tell you how to live. It's good at telling you how life works. And I think you can look to art and literature for you know, or just ways to think outside yourself for those kind of answers. But yeah, I've always felt, maybe I do feel that it's in conflict in some ways too, you know? Like, or that at some,
It certainly can be in conflict.
Right. I've gone back and forth on it, right? Sometimes I've been like, oh, you know, science can do its thing and religion can do its thing, and you know, and if both of them are helping people, you know, deal with the difficulties of living, then that's great, you know. And then there are other times when I think that, yeah, that they can't really coexist. And so when I meet individuals for whom they do coexist in the same person, in the same consciousness, I'm always been curious about this, and this is probably the best chance I've ever had to spend time talking to somebody about it, because when I've had those chances in the past with colleagues, I haven't taken them. I've steered away from those conversations, I suppose.
Well, it's personal, right? So
yeah,
it's not usual you get to see a couple scientists talking about this stuff. Yeah, I mean, I think you're pretty thoughtful on this stuff too, actually. I mean, I've really enjoyed talking to you about it.
Good, thanks. Yeah. I mean, like yeah, that's, yeah, I don't know. You know, I feel like I'm a pretty open-minded person, and I like to think that my science training has contributed a lot to that. I feel like this, in the second half of this has turned more into like a science talk than what it means to be human talk. But I suppose that, you know, that it's we're modeling a certain type of human,
I think
right?
science has become just such a huge part of my life, and I love it. It has made me better on all these things. It's just that I think if we only think about things from a scientific point of view, we kind of miss out on some of the most interesting things. Mm-hmm. The things that actually might give us some warrant for some of the hope that we really need too. So it's like I've kind of moved to a place where, you know, I was raised to be in conflict with mainstream science. I'm really not right now. So I certainly believe that you can be in conflict, right? But at the same token, it's not a complete view of the world to me. I mean, there's more to it. I mean, you don't have to go to faith. There's other things too, where it's just there's more to this world than just that.
This might be our last question due to time, and it's the same question for both of you. How optimistic are you about the future of humanity? So the question that the student has asked is, Will we eventually evolve to act more justly with each other, or will we be forever hardwired to act the way our ancestors did? And it seems like you've expressed some positive, outlook that we will adapt. And so I wonder, is that view based on science, or is it kind of a wish? And you suggested, you said maybe I could provide some evidence that we won't move forward, or that we wouldn't necessarily evolve in a positive direction. So I would just like to ask you each what you think the future of humanity looks like, and then what your foundation for thinking that is.
I'm optimistic. And that's, despite, I suppose, evidence to the contrary in the news that we see so regularly. But I am, and I'll reiterate what I said before. I feel like we're that this is new to all of us, right? I mean, it's all what we're all used to, but living in this kind of a society, living this closely, being this interconnected with people all over the world, this is new, and I think that we're going to have to, it's going to take our biology a while to catch up to our technology and our society. But I think it can, and I think that, being really aware and mindful about, how closely related we are to each other, and having an appreciation of the close interrelationship between humans is a strong way to get there.
Thank you.
Yeah, so in some ways I agree with you. So I would just say that, for this, I really do think an important voice to read is Martin Luther King. He wrote a lot. You guys are all students, right? And you're used to only reading what the professors ask you to read. This is something that's worth. I'm assigning something to you, okay? No, I'm not. I have no authority over you. But really read some of the stuff. There's something lost in his voice, I think, for a moment. Like I said, we're 50 years after he was assassinated. Our world is still segregated. I think the way how I would summarize how King saw us, he saw us as both fallen and God image. There's it's that paradox, that these two things together. So on one hand, there's the real hope. There's also a real possibility for things to be worse. And I think that's kind of the truth of our situation, where we can continue and really continue deep injustice in our world. We're so good at even just doing it so effectively through structures where we don't even have to personally participate in it, except by just to create the structure and walk away from it, and then just benefit from it and just pretend like it doesn't affect us. It's almost like, well, I'm not going to get into that story. We'll talk about that tomorrow if you guys want. But at the same token, I think there's that ability that we have to respond to a call to the good, a call to justice, that we don't even always know why or have a good grounding for it, but I think God put that in us so that, I think we want a just world, even though it's irrational to even believe that there is this thing as justice, and there is that for that. And I think to the point that even, I think people who don't even have a good grounding for that actually still feel that way. I think that's kind of how we've been made. And we really need a generation of people to rise up and make us a better world. And I want to be a part of that, but frankly, when I'm starting to get older, I'm 39 now, I'm starting to realize I'm almost middle-aged. I used to always say our parents' generation, but I'm not going to be able to say that very much longer. I'd like you to think, I'd like to think I'm going to be one of the ones that was pointing things in the right direction, but maybe you guys could be the generation that really takes us into a better world. If you look out there the way this world is, this cannot be enough for you. We need a much better world, a world that we haven't yet seen. And I think that's what's so compelling about Martin Luther King. So if you judge us based on a curve, we don't come out that bad. But he actually saw an image of a much better unseen world order. A world order where we actually lived as family across those divides. And wouldn't it be great if you guys were the generation?
It seems like maybe that's one thing you each agree on, that idea of being a family and of recognizing that more fully. Do you have any closing comment before we part ways?
I just like talking to you. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Thank you for sharing. Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Join me in thanking both our speakers.